Thank you. Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about the untranslatability of Shakespeare's poems and drama. I will consider why Shakespeare's works have been rejected as untranslatable and therefore describe the challenges of Shakespeare translation and explore some examples that test the debatable notion of untranslatability. Evaluating then new strategies and translation solutions offered for Shakespeare's works, I will be working towards the conclusion that translation theorists should rethink their conceptions of the function of translation in order to develop a fuller understanding of the pragmatics of translation and the need for new innovative methodology. So this is my table of content. We will start with the introduction, then theoretical background, followed by Shakespeare in translation. I want to tell you something about Shakespeare's poetry and plays, new strategies and solutions, and then we will conclude. So, the well-known Shakespearean and founder of the Royal Shakespeare Company, Sir Peter Hall, was once asked what he thought of translation of Shakespeare. "Oh," he responded brusquely, "Shakespeare is untranslatable." When Peter Hall dismissed the very thought of Shakespeare's translatability, he was probably not doing so out of any consideration of the theory of translation. He wanted to express that Shakespeare, or even only Shakespeare, lies beyond translation because he is sui generis, and therefore limited for an English-speaking audience. In defiance to Peter Hall's unreflexive assertion, no one will seriously deny that the works of Shakespeare have become part of the common cultural heritage shared by all the literate societies inhabiting this planet. The Shakespeare oeuvre owes this status, the reputation of one of the world literature classics, to the efforts of translators, who have brought the bard into their own language. But all too often, translators, in accomplishing to their task, are confronted with inherent untranslatables, preventing the full rendition of the original text into the target language, however good the translator's talent and workshop skills. The poetic and dramatic works of Shakespeare are leading to the disquieting question now whether his works in manifold translations are in fact faithful reflections of the Shakespeare available in its native language and culture. In fact, several critics have claimed that the content, the form, the style, the rhythm, as well as the extraordinary wordplays and culture, specific terms of Shakespeare's works, are often untranslatable as they were composed at a particular era and addressed to particular people. So looking at the theoretical background now, translation, following Susan Barsnett, is an activity which involves reading a text written in one language and then endeavoring to recreate it in another language. So arguments about an ethical demand of perfect faithfulness on the original, both in content and in form, that has been regarded as an iron criterion, have raged for centuries, accompanied by debates about whether there can be exact equivalence between languages. James Holmes dismissed the idea that there could be exact equivalence across languages as perverse, pointing out that each translator will produce his own version of a text and no two will be identical. This process of change will of course involve both loss and gain. Any transformation of the original text into a different language will involve a falling off through the replacement of one structure with another. But whatever linguistic losses that might accompany translation, there are also gains. Through translation, we can access works which would otherwise be beyond reach. And there's also another benefit of translation. Translation can be a force for innovation, as Susan Barsnett argues, by refreshing the text for new generations of readers. Throughout the history of translation, the question, is translation possible or impossible, has repeatedly been asked and debated among philosophers, linguists, as well as translation theorists. Emily Apter, for example, seeks to make a case for the importance of untranslatability, defined as that which resists easy comprehension and, in consequence, easy consumption and substitution. Her argument is that understanding untranslatability depends on knowing more than one language. So to this extent, she is making a case against monolingualism and against the domestication of the foreign language to a target audience. On the surface, this looks like an important point, but anyone who has ever engaged in translating anything knows that the primary task for a translator is to engage with untranslatability, which is an inevitable aspect of translating, and to find even a solution to the most daunting of problems. So taking issue with Apter now, the translation study scholar Lawrence Venuti points out that untranslatability should not be seen as an aesthetic or philosophical category, but as a purely abstract idea, which he argues only discourages anyone who wishes to investigate the politics of translation by smearing translatability as dubious. So with this knowledge bearing in mind now, we move on to Shakespeare in translation. Although Shakespeare's works are among the most frequently translated works today, Shakespeare translation has retained a delicate matter in translation study. Different views manifest in discussions of the so-called untranslatability of Shakespeare's poetry and drama. Many scholars have apparently felt called upon to come to the bard's rescue and expose any injustice and disrespectful attempt to the scholarly accuracy. Therefore, Shakespeare translation was often ignored or treated with disdain. In the opposite direction, one increasingly hears pleas for more free and creative translations of Shakespeare. So, for Shakespeare's poetry, translating Shakespeare's poetry has been one of the arduous problems that pained many translators worldwide. Although his sonnets have been translated into several languages, no other foreign text has been translated as frequently and as insistently as Shakespeare's sonnet cycle into German. There has long been the sense that the core of his sonnets was lost in translation. It is the feeling that lies behind Robert Frost's dictum that poetry is what gets lost in translation. The main challenges facing translation of Shakespeare's poetry are vocabulary, syntax, word order, idiom, phrasing, pointing, rhythm, the use of speech such as similes and metaphors, and the symbolic imagery, which have no exact counterpart in other languages. So the complex effects of the combination of all these elements make the source texts of Shakespeare's great lyric poetry. So let's take the line from Lorenzo's speech in The Merchant of Venice now, Act 5, Scene 1. How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank. Most of the translations of this passage, and trust me, there are many of them, are not very good. Here's one of the better ones, published by Schlegel in German. Wie süß das Mondlicht auf dem Hügel schläft. This passage is very famous in English for its mellifluous quality. It is obvious that the musical softness of a line like this cannot be translated into any other language, in which the sweet sleep assonance is lost and where the long drawn-out sounds do not exist. But any change in sound, nuance, resonance is the more shattering for a disturbance of the finely tuned music of the original. So to read Shakespeare outside his original poems is to take risk of losing him. So one is tempted to stake the provisional conclusion that Shakespeare at his most poetic is untranslatable. Now, after Shakespeare's sonnets in translation have been discussed, the next topic will focus on his plays. Shakespeare may be said to be untranslatable because his texts are a very unique set of linguistic patterns that cannot be duplicated in a different system. In fact, there are some details in the speeches of Henry V which trigger negative inherent untranslatability, namely the words which refer to the social divisions in English society. So, gentlemen in England, you noblest English, and most problematically, yeomen, the difficulty here is that none of the recipient language cultures has a social tradition exactly reflecting the English social divisions, and what is even worse, the language available for the translation of these concepts has been tainted by its usage in the landmark works of the respective Polish systems. So Schlegel selected Landvolk, far from a perfect choice out of a bag of equally or even more inadequate alternatives. There are still other problems of equivalence. Shakespeare is fond of words and wordplays. Double meaning is widely used to create ambiguity and some effects to enhance linguistic connotations and to generate new meanings and new words. He has strong sympathy and compassion to word coining. So let's have a look at Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 1, where Hamlet asks, upon what ground? Ground here means cause, but in the next line, a gravedigger takes the word in the sense of land, country. So the translator should be alert to the confusion that might come up choosing the wrong equivalent. He needs to explain the complexity in a footnote and convey the meaning embedded in the word ground. Some untranslatables generally do not nullify the practicability of translation, but in literary translation, they may be crucial to the full transfer of the original text. For the reasons mentioned above, several critics have claimed that Shakespeare's poems and drama are untranslatable. If we look at new strategies and translation solutions now, one now hears a lot of pleas for more creative translations of Shakespeare, showing less submissive attitude and a greater concern for contemporary relevance and performability. Calls for free and adaptive forms of translation are now increasingly forthcoming from theorists and practitioners. So Barsnet, for example, blends theory and practical advice. Her advice for poetry translation is similar to the advice she gives theater translators: to focus on the play of language in the text. She argues that texts consist of language nouns, verbs, and all kinds of lexical and grammatical patterns, the very material which a translator primarily works with to construct their translation. The task is less to copy an original, but to compose an analogous text. Moreover, Barsnet points out that the two crucial elements in translating poetry are joyfulness and playfulness, which give the lie to the old negative idea of poetry being what is lost in translation. The transplantation of poetry is therefore a creative act, since it results in the blossoming of a new poem in a new language. The contemporary commitment to revitalizing Shakespeare for modern readers and stage implies a rejection of the museum character they feel is the outcome of philosophical orthodoxy and the notion of translational equivalence. Translation throws overboard its subservience to the original, along with its claim of being the original's authentic representation. So let us now return to Peter Hall's comment that Shakespeare cannot be translated. It takes a simple reorientation of our attitude towards the relationship between text and translation to overcome Hall's common sense. We should abandon the expectation that a translator will achieve the hopeless task of recovering and repeating a unique original. And then we will be able to adopt a model of translation in terms of a process of gain and a process of textual extension. Contemporary translation theorists and practitioners provide for new strategies which mean innovation and more open interpretation instead of stagnation in traditional orthodox concepts and slavish attachment of the original. So consequently, translation involves artistic creativity, not a workshop of equivalence. Shakespeare had definitely challenged translation. But with new strategies as prerequisite, translation of Shakespeare's works is possible and even inevitable. So to say it in Susan Barsnett's words now, there cannot be such a thing as world literature without translation. And now at the end of my presentation, you can decide on the debate of translatability versus untranslatability of Shakespeare, and to quote Shakespeare once last, as you like it. Thank you for your attention.